Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our virtual Preserving Historic Places session, Structure for Motion. I'm Suzanne Stanis, Director of Heritage Education for Indiana Landmarks and a member of the Preserving Historic Places Conference Planning Committee. Please continue to watch the conference website for updates on virtual conference programs September 30th through October 1st. We'll offer 2 more virtual sessions, May 13th on comprehensive community wealth and June 24th on the rehabilitation of the Eagles Theater in Wabash. So please watch your email for registration information. I want to thank my conference committee co-sponsors or co-administrators, Jeannie Regan-Denius of the Indiana Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology, and Liz Monroe from Indiana University. The conference and these virtual sessions would not be possible without the generous financial support of our partners, the Indiana Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology, Indiana Landmarks, Indiana University, and the St. Joseph County Commissioners. Our sponsors include RC Engineers, City of South Bend, the Cornelius O'Brien Lecture Series, Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority, Marvin Windows, the National Park Service, Wischanny Elsner Associates, and Visit South Bend, Mishawaka. Supporters include Berglund, Cultural Resource Analysts, Historic Preservation and Heritage Consulting, Indiana Archaeology Council, Keyser Consulting, Old National Bank, Ratio Architects, and RE Diamond and Associates. We're using the webinar version of Zoom today, so attendees' microphones are muted and your video is hidden. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function, and I'll be moderating and asking questions as time allows. The session is being recorded and will be available shortly after the presentation. So please allow me to introduce Dr. Elvis Badillo. Dr. Badillo is an anthropological archaeologist whose research focuses on topics within human-environment interactions, digital heritage, and 3D geospatial methodologies. His current research projects include studying settlement patterns, land use, change and processes of urbanization, investigating the impacts of long-term mining practices on local landscapes, and the applications of virtual reality in research and education. Dr. Badillo is involved in multiple collaborative projects in southern Mexico, southern Peru, and Indiana. And just to clarify, that's the Mexico and Peru south of the border, not in Miami County. He works with academics within and outside of his discipline, cultural resource managers, museum personnel, and local community organizations. Dr. Badillo, welcome to Preserving Historic Places.
Thank you, and thanks again for the invite. I want to just also say thank you for the organizers for putting this together. Hello, welcome to my talk entitled Structure for Motion, 3D Documentation in Indiana and Beyond. I'm really excited about this opportunity to talk with you guys about this particular subject matter, especially to those of you who are new to Structure for Motion or may not know what it is. If you know me at all, I'm very passionate about this, and I always like to kind of spread the word about this particular method because I do believe it does have some benefits for us in terms of scholarship, public outreach, and even education. So this is a little bit redundant. I believe Suzanne already went over some of this here, but I did want to say I'm currently working there at Indiana State University, and I wanted to highlight the work we're doing in Geospatial and Virtual Archaeology Laboratory and Studio. We say this GVALS instead of GVALS, but GVALS is our lab there where we work on student training in geospatial and 3D technologies. We also offer classes where we teach these things at Indiana State. So let's go ahead and let's get started here. Our agenda for today, we're going to start out with an introduction to structure for motion photogrammetry. I'll tell you a little bit about what it is, kind of how it works in a basic way. I'm also going to give a slight demonstration on how the actual software works, which I think is kind of unique to this. Doing the virtual session, we're actually able to kind of look at the computer and follow someone along on the desktop. So I figured we would do that together here. In the middle of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about cemetery work in Indiana. Specifically, we're going to talk about the Bethel Cemetery Relocation Project. And then we're going to move on and talk about other research in Mexico and Peru. So that's kind of our outline and our agenda for today here. So getting started, what is structure for motion? Well, it's a photogrammetric technique used to digitally reconstruct real-world 3D phenomena from a series of 2D photos. So we're using just 2D images to reconstruct things scaling down to artifact level. So if you look over here, you have a whistle that was found in Oaxaca, Mexico, a projectile point. And over here in the top right, you can actually see an entire bridge, right? So an architectural feature that was captured using a series of photos. And then the main backdrop here is the site of Muray in Peru, which has been we've been able to photo model it without using drones. And I did want to mention that for these larger site scale type of models, we don't actually have to use drones all the time, as long as you have the right perspective on it. And you'll see why in a little bit too. So this one was made just by kind of walking around this footpath that kind of goes around the site and taking images as we were walking. And so as you can see, my partner Lindsay here is standing to get an idea for scale. And this was one of those images that was used to reconstruct this 3D model. So these are all 3D models here. It's from Oaxaca. This one is actually, the bridge is from Washington County here in Indiana. So how does structure for motion work? I think I get this question all the time, and the best way I can describe it is just with a little exercise. We're going to use our two eyes, and our eyes are going to be kind of like cameras, and we're going to use our brain, which is our processor or computer. So if you do this exercise with me, if you hold out your finger in front of your face at about 6 inches, shut your left eye, take in kind of what the image looks like. You have your finger and all the stuff there in the background. Switch eyes again and again and again. And what you're going to notice is that your finger seems to be actually shifting left and right. And then when you open both eyes together, your computer quickly on the fly does a calculation and you get a sense for depth, right? So that's kind of your depth perception. Now imagine instead of just having two cameras with like your eyes have just the two cameras, having multiple places where a camera can be put right around an object. So here in this diagram, we see the object that we're 3D modeling. So with these 4 different vantage points, we can reconstruct even more. Now imagine getting every single angle and actually recording those angles and then giving that to the computer, and the computer can process those things and actually start to reconstruct those angles and those distances from where these photos were taken. So here in the diagram, you can see an image was taken here, the camera was moved, taken here, here, and here. And from this movement, we're able to start to reconstruct the structure of the 3D model. And that's structure for motion, essentially. Looking at the images, what they've done here is kind of depicted what are pixels or features that are corresponding between these two images and between these two, right? So these are called tie points, and I may refer to those again later on in the presentation, but I want us to kind of understand that the computer is going to be going pixel by pixel, right? Thousands of pixels, and searching for places between pairs of photos where there are correspondences. So something to note is that with structure for motion, you have to have a lot of overlap between photos, typically 2/3 overlap. So the documentation using structure for motion is often thought of in 2 different stages. We have our photo capture stage, and then we have our processing stage. Here in the image, you can see I'm doing some photo capture on the left, and then we have Courtney Bell, ISU student, doing photo capture here on the right. We're both using what's called the walk-around method. And luckily, most archaeologists have this kind of equipment with them. They have cameras and scale bars. So this is usually something that's already on hand in the archaeologist toolbox. So with the walk-around method, the goal is to go around the object, taking photos as you go, and then you eventually create what is called a photo set, right? A series of photos. So here, I'm actually just shooting a petroglyph that's in the natural rock outcrop, and I'll end up walking all the way around it, getting every single angle. And I'm using what's called a freehand style. Right? Over here, Courtney is actually using a tripod, but she's doing the very same thing. She's just gonna go around the grave marker and she's going to shoot in every single angle that she can, but she's using a tripod specifically to make sure that her photo is stable and we don't have a lot of blur in the photo. So if you remember from the diagram and kind of talking about what structure for motion, how it all kind of works, if we have blur in our photos, locating those features and tie points that correspond becomes difficult for the computer. And so that's what she's doing. She's stabilizing her images and going around. I would also like to mention too that in both of these instances, we're using scale bars, and that's very important for this process because we're going to be doing scientific work with this, and we want to make sure we have our true scale if we want it. This is another type of photo capture method. We often refer to this one as turntable method. And basically, this is where you'll have the artifact on a turntable or Lazy Susan, and you'll rotate it every 5 degrees, basically moving the artifact and rotating that and keeping the camera positioned on a tripod. So the camera stays stationary and the object is moving. And then every time you move that turntable, you take a picture with the tripod, or excuse me, with the camera. And then all of those images can be used in the very same way that you would when you're doing the walk around method. Both of these are kind of your primary methods for photo capture within terrestrial photogrammetry, I should say. There are other kinds of photogrammetry that involve aerial methods, where pictures are being taken from the sky, either by a kite or a balloon or a drone, right? But in terms of ground-based stuff, this is what we're talking about here: walk around method and turntable. So once we've done the photo capture, we have a set of photos that we need to process. So we have our image processing step. This always involves, well, not always, but usually if you want to be quick about it, involves a high performance computer and photogrammetry software. The software we use at Indiana State is Agisoft Metashape. That's actually a pretty standard software. It's an industry standard, but it's also economical. So that's why we're using it in the educational setting. But if you're interested in doing this kind of stuff yourself, I would recommend downloading Meshroom. Meshroom is a free software. You can download it and play around with photogrammetry without any cost. So here is Luisa Laura at Indiana State. She's actually doing a reconstruction of one of these headstones. And depending on how many images you have, the resolution of those images, and the speed of your computer, the time to actually create one of these reconstructions is variable, right? So it just depends on those factors. So oftentimes you're waiting somewhere between 15 to 45 minutes for an object of this size, like a grave marker. And if you look at the scene here, Lou is actually, she's got a book in front of her, so she's able to read in between steps if it takes a little time. But then she also has her laptop over to the right, and that's where she's entering in metadata and paradata as she goes through the process of reconstruction. Okay, so this is a workflow kind of chart. I really want you to take away from this slide just the basic terms. We have our alignment phase, and this is where we start to align all of those images, right? The computer starts to figure out where the camera was positioned when it was taking that shot. And those images are all working together to do that. And it's creating a measurement of depth from that camera station to the object itself. That moves into our dense cloud or dense cloud generation, where we actually have these fine points that are placed in 3D space all around the object, giving it structure. But then from that, we interpolate the actual structure, which is called a mesh. Here, I'm actually visualizing what is called the wireframe mesh. But the mesh is made up of multiple triangles, which we'll revisit later. And then once we have our structure coming out of that mesh, we wrap the structure in what's called a photorealistic texture. And as you can see here, that's kind of what it's just coming from the photos itself, and it's being wrapped around the 3D object. In the end, once everything is processed, we have a 3D representation, also known as a 3D model. So you may have heard a lot of people talk about 3D modeling in archaeology or in other sciences, and this is basically what it is. It's a process, it's a procedure. I think a lot of people forget too that it is a procedure, and there's always decisions being made at every single step to create this 3D representation. Now, as you can see in this representation, I've got these scale bars here. I'm going to go to adding scale. These particular scale bars are actually really nice. They were made by Cultural Heritage Imaging. And what's really great about them is that these things, these little circles here, are actually, they're basically targets that automate the procedure of putting flags down in the center of them, right? So these are automated markers. The computer then, when you have this little detection algorithm that you use, will detect exactly where the center of these are. And then you can actually add scale in a very precise way, because the distance between these 2 points, right, these 2 points here, that's known, and that's written here on the scale bar itself. And these particular ones can actually get us within accuracies of sub-millimeter. So over on the right-hand side, I'm using another 3D modeling software, Autodesk Recap Photo. I'm being able to make some measurements based on my 3D model. Got some pins in there that I'm measuring with. And then this one down here is an Agisoft Metashape, also being able to make those measurements. I want to mention kind of, if you look down here at the model and then over here, you're getting an idea for the high resolution texture. You can really see that moss popping out on the side of this 3D model. So if you're thinking about archaeology and why this would be useful, definitely. I mean, if you're at an archaeological site and you've already left, or whatever it was that you were measuring is then destroyed, because excavation is a destructive process, then you can at least go back and measure the 3D model and use that for analysis. I'm currently writing a paper about those petroglyphs that are in those natural rock outcrops. And because I used photogrammetry to begin with, and I recorded them all that way, I'm able to, from here, from Terre Haute, Indiana, make measurements on those petroglyphs and compare them across each of those features. All right, so let's go ahead and try a demonstration here. I'm going to exit out of my PowerPoint, and I'm going to share Agisoft with you. Okay, you should be in Agisoft Metashape, and this is kind of what our interface looks like. Here in the middle, we have this little navigational ball, and I'll be using that to kind of twirl around. But I want to draw your attention to these 6 images here. These are images that I took of this frieze that's just above the doorway into a tomb in Mexico. And this was done as I was leaving. I just turned around and took a few different photos and decided I want to use it as a training data set, or at least for these types of demonstrations. But you can see in these photos that there's definite overlap, right? You can definitely see each of these designs and all the images. But I also took this extra one here as kind of a map for the computer. Let me call this a context photo. This one here at least will help me pull all these together if these 5 are having trouble stitching together in the reconstruction, or the alignment, excuse me. So let's go ahead and do this on the fly. I'm going to show you what the alignment looks like. We go up to the workflow tab, hit align photos. I'm going to use the defaults and hit OK. And so now the computer is just going in, looking at all those pixels between photo pairs, and it's going to estimate where those camera positions are. And sure enough, here we have something. Looks kind of like our frieze. Let's visualize our cameras here. There we go. Okay, so if you look here, we can see the 5 photos out front, and then the one in the back that I took shooting down. This is our context photo, and these are the ones that we did for texture and reconstruction. So that's how fast 6 photos works. And of course, I'm using a high-performance laptop here. But you can imagine when you start to get in the orders of 60, 80, hundreds, thousands of photos, it's going to take quite a bit of time to process and do that alignment. So we're not going to actually go through each step in real time, but I am going to show you something that I've already reconstructed here. This is the next step in that phase. After alignment, we get into our dense point cloud. You can see it here, and if I zoom in, you'll start to see those actual points. See all these little points here. So it's just placing a point using those depth maps. And if I actually turn this up sideways, what you're going to notice is there's no data right in here. Right? So if you remember, let's take a look at where those cameras were taken. So all these photos were taken kind of shooting downwards, and there's no data coming up in this direction. So if I wanted to actually have points put here, I'd have to take some photos from down here. Luckily, when you actually do create a mesh and interpolate a mesh, it can make a guess and it can still make a solid surface. So we did get a surface here. It's not as accurate because there was really no data and it's making an interpolation between these 2 points, but it did a pretty good job at doing that. If I turn this into a wireframe visualization, we can at least just look at those triangles. You can see that your triangles are kind of tighter and smaller up in here, but as you kind of look at places where there's not as much data, sometimes those triangles get a bit more sparse. And then if we want, we can have the shaded model. So this is still the mesh and it's just shaded with the colors. And then of course we go and we do the photorealistic texture. You know, and now it looks a bit more like a digital surrogate. It's like, it looks very much like it, but it's not exactly like. And always remember that this is part of a process, and that, you know, there are places, for instance, under here where things aren't quite right. And if you look real closely, you can see that that texture doesn't look good. But from the outside, it looks pretty close. If you're interested in this kind of work and maybe getting your feet wet, there are some tutorials out there. If you just get on YouTube, you can search and find tutorials on how to use Agisoft Metashape. But also, I also, hopefully in the chat box, they can put some resources there I have on my website if you're interested in learning some more. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share the screen again with our PowerPoint presentation. So that kind of concludes the talk about just structure from motion in general, and hopefully that got you a little excited to try it out yourself. Let's move into what is the Bethel Cemetery Relocation Project, our case study. So as you can see here, we have our downtown Indianapolis area, and then over to the south and west, we have the airport, and Bethel Cemetery was nestled right up against that there. So Bethel Cemetery was established in the first half of the 19th century and was in use for over 100 years until the last burial in 1935. Many of the buried people at Bethel Cemetery were amongst the earliest European American settlers in Marion County. In 2018, as a result of planned urban expansion, Cardno, an environmental and cultural resource management firm, was contracted to plan and conduct a relocation of this historic cemetery. This project was done in a broad collaboration. Cardno actually collaborated with a lot of different universities, institutions to achieve their goals here. We had Indiana University, Indiana State University, IUPUI, and University of Indy. A lot of students were involved and trained, and we had a lot of other specialists and professionals that were involved in the excavation as well. If you're interested in learning more about the archaeology there, what was found, and in terms of the interpretation and identifying individuals that may not have had one of these grave markers, I would refer you to Dr. Brooke Drew's talk, also at Indiana State University, and the link will be provided in the chat there. So from the data gathered in preliminary survey by Cardno, they used geophysical equipment to look in the subsurface without actually excavating. They used GPR and resistivity, I believe, and they were able to identify that there are possibly 400 to 450 people buried at Bethel Cemetery. And that is kind of in contrast to how many headstones were actually on the surface. From what we can tell, there are a little over 170 headstones, yet 400 people in the ground. So that was kind of an anomaly, but we wanted to make sure we were prepared in terms of this relocation project. So specifically, I'm going to talk about not the archaeology per se, but the methods and this unique method that we use to actually document the site. So from its inception, the site itself was designed to use structure from motion methods instead of hand-drawn paper maps. Right? So typically in archaeology, when we're doing excavation, we document things with hand-drawn maps. Sometimes we use graph paper, or even we do these detailed sketch maps of excavated units. But here we decided to go structure from motion all the way. To my knowledge, this is probably one of the first projects in Indiana in terms of cultural resource management projects that uses this method at such a large scale. So what was our rationale in doing this? At the time in 2018, there were a lot of papers which cited proof of concept type of papers that cited structure from motion as being time saving on one end, but also resource saving in terms of financial resources, right? It was an expedient way to actually document things, and it was a way that you could document things with sufficient or equal precision to those hand-drawn maps or even those field sketches. I had been doing photogrammetry for at least 2 years by the time 2018 rolled around, and I could definitely attest to the fact that it is a method that can be integrated into the excavation process. So that was our goal. We wanted to integrate it into the excavation. However, prior to excavation, we wanted to also use structure from motion and test trying to get a 3D model of the entire cemetery. So here at the bottom, you can actually see the mesh of the cemetery without a texture. You can see all the little headstones there. And we did this, actually, this is quite interesting. We did this using a GoPro and a selfie stick. So as you can see here, I'm holding a little GoPro there on the end of a selfie stick that I probably picked up at a convenience store. And Ryan Peterson and I, we just walked back and forth across the cemetery going from north to south, all the way across in a grid-like systematic format, and then from east to west, right? So we did all that walking. We had the GoPro set with an intervalometer, meaning taking a second, every second it would take a photo or every half second. And we produced 13,000 photos. It's a lot of photos, and you can't imagine poor Lou sitting there trying to process those photos by herself on a desktop. That's a lot of photos to process on a regular computer. So we actually had the help of Indiana University's Research Technologies, the supercomputer. So at Indiana University, that supercomputer was able to help us do this reconstruction until we have ourselves a model of the whole surface there. That surface is then turned into a digital surface model, so a 2D representation of that elevation change. You can see here I've got high elevations in red and low elevations in blue. Kind of the center here is much higher than the stuff as it kind of tapered off towards the edges of the cemetery. You can see the footprints of all of the headstones. Not every single headstone was captured in this way because the GoPro wasn't quite high enough to get the data from the top of each headstone that were really tall. But it did a pretty good job of grabbing every single footprint. So we were able to digitize all of these in ArcGIS. And then the cemetery was actually given scale by using what are called ground control points, or GCPs. And that works just the same way as with those scale bars. You know, if we have a known distance between two, we can actually plug that into Agisoft. But if we also have known coordinates, we can georeference this and give a coordinate system. In addition to doing the surface, we also modeled each and every one of these headstones. So you can see here, we did this for preservation's sake, just in case anything were to happen between one location and another. So we have all of our nice headstones here modeled with the textures. But then over here, I left one without texture so that you can get an idea for what photogrammetry and structure from motion can actually do with one of the headstones run at a very high resolution in Agisoft. You can really see that lettering there. Also, prior to excavation, since we were planning to do this so from the beginning of the project, we wanted to test our method, our actual workflow. So we have this guy, Burial X, famous little burial here, which is a plastic skeleton. I'm going to say thank you to Dr. Jeremy Wilson, who actually allowed us to use his lab skeleton here and dumped it in the ground. And of course, we have Ryan Peterson, who's the overall supervisor and manager of the entire project at Bethel. He was nice enough to go in the back and dig a hole for us to test in. So we set up our scale bars and we went at it. I took a bunch of photos systematically around the burial and also up close to get a better idea for the geometry. I took some kneeling down photos here, as well as some photos to kind of make the texture of the burial come out in the 3D model once it was finished. And of course, those scale bars were used to georeference the model and give it scale. So part of our workflow was to use a total station, right, a laser transit, to actually shoot in each of these points, or at least 4 points per burial, And that way we could georeference our model, putting it in space in addition to the surface that we had actually modeled beforehand. So this is the result. This is our 3D model of Burial X. We were able to detect, obviously the marker detected every single one of these targets. And internally, this has sub-millimeter accuracy. And I think this is, I mean, if we could all kind of agree, this is pretty good. I mean, if you want to use it as a reference data set after an excavation is over, this gives you a lot of data, right? So that's part of the reason we want to do this with all of these individuals, not because we want to use burials for public outreach. That's not really the purpose here in this case. But we did want to have this stored as reference data sets as we were doing the analysis and trying to figure out who some of these people were that were buried with and unidentified. After kind of doing our test excavation, we developed a field manual so that when the summer started and we started in on the excavation, our technicians in the field would know what to do. They would know how to take their photos, where the context shots should be taken, where texture shots should be taken. And they also knew how to fill out the paperwork that went with the excavation worksheets. So in here, excuse me, the paperwork actually does show places where you can put your control point coordinates, but also other metadata and paradata that should get recorded along with the burial itself. This is actually available online. I've put it down here, a little kind of link to it there in TDAR, and it should be in the chat as well. So if you're planning on doing a historic burial site, this might be a good reference for you. So after it's all said and done, 543 people were recovered there at Bethel Cemetery. And of those 543, we were able to model over 300. Not every single burial was something that we needed to do photogrammetry on. And that just depends on, you know, what's actually there, what's left over. If it's not something that has a lot of definition, then you can just go in and take a regular 2D image. But then for all of the other ones, we do have all of those data recorded and archived away for reference later. And because we have everything georeferenced within that local grid system, we actually, using Autodesk Maya, had some success to bring in the entire cemetery surface and then just put in the burials as they were georeferenced. And sure enough, they popped right into place as we expected, right with whatever the grave marker is that was with them there. So here's an example of two different burials that popped right into place underneath these grave markers. We actually ended up doing this with a bunch of other burials, but we did not finish putting all the burials underneath the ground surface. We don't really have a reason to do that yet. We have actually rendered every single one of these burials so that we can have them in our database and complete. So what are the benefits? What did we really learn from the project? I think that taking a sample of 30 burials, we learned that it takes an on average 12 minutes per burial to do that photo capture process. Right? Some of them were really fast, 3 minutes, boom, you're done. Others took a little bit of finessing to do. Maybe there was a lighting situation that needed to be taken care of. But I would say 12 minutes plus an extra added 8 minutes gives you time to kind of set the scene before doing photo capture, as well as fill out paperwork. 20 minutes total to do photo capture on every single burial. And then we decided that in the field, we would do these alignment checks with a high performance laptop. We'd run an alignment on the burial data as it came in, and that would let us know whether or not the bioarchaeologist could go in and start to remove the human remains and get them ready for relocation. So our in-field alignment checks took about 12 minutes tops. And I think altogether 32 minutes is pretty good, right? To document at such a high quality each and every one of these excavations. We actually did publish a paper on this experience and some of our pitfalls. We've documented those as well. So if you're interested in doing this, I would say check out our article and hopefully learn from some of the mistakes we made and even some of our successes as well. So the big question, I mean, should we replace older methods with structure from motion? I just want to say, I still believe that there is merit. making these hand-drawn maps. I still think these sketches are important for us to do. In this case, we decided to forego that because we needed to do things in a timely manner. But we also had all the resources to make sure we weren't going to lose any data. But just in general, using those traditional methods, I think engages our brains in a different way, allowing us a different way of knowing the excavated unit, also those features within it. And then in those drawings, archaeologists can actually highlight specific places that they saw in the fields, like things that they want to make sure is noted during the interpretive process, right? So I think there's that kind of step too, that as you're actually making that drawing, you can highlight specific things that you want to make sure make it into the report in the end. And then lastly, when you're making hand-drawn maps, you have another level of redundancy. So I think that's important as well. After Bethel Cemetery was excavated, all of those individuals were relocated to the Concordia Cemetery over here in southern Indianapolis. This time we actually got to use a drone or unmanned aerial vehicle, and that helps out a lot because the drone can carry the camera and give you those angles from up above. So shooting down, we actually successfully made a 3D model with just drone images. And this is a screenshot from ArcGIS Pro. The reason I want to show this is because ArcGIS Pro does a pretty good job handling 3D data. As you can see here, I've got the ortho photo on one side here, and then on the other side, I have the 3D model that corresponds. And they both have their coordinate system, so they pop right into place. But it always boggles the mind to visualize something like this because, for instance, here you have a grave marker that looks very small, but as soon as you turn it sideways with that third dimension, you can see it's a nice tall grave marker here. Same thing with these guys back here. So I always find that fascinating. With the Bethel Cemetery data, we also experimented a little bit with virtual reality. We did have a fairly nice high definition model. We also had each headstone that were shot in individually. And so we were able to place some of these headstones with the surface model that we had created. Right? So you can actually read, hopefully it's coming in nice and smooth for you guys, but you can read some of the text that's on these headstones. So we decided to go ahead and bring this model into virtual reality as well. And then the new model, the one at Concordia that currently stands, we did the same thing. And I actually have them both side by side in a program called Unity that can handle these higher resolution 3D models. So and here you can actually see the old Bethel there in the distance floating. And then the new Bethel Cemetery right over here. And we just put a simple navigation system in there where you can teleport yourself around, exploring various parts of the cemetery. But what's really interesting is next to each other, you can actually compare the layout and the very different family plots to each other just in one virtual space. So that kind of concludes my talk about Bethel Cemetery and the relocation project. I think it was successful in the sense that it was successfully implemented. We did get a lot of good data as reference data. And I think if CRA companies are thinking of doing stuff like this in the future, it may be an option, to think about whether or not structure from motion is appropriate for the work. And I will say that it's not always the solution. As much as I would like to think that 3D modeling is the solution to everything in archaeology, it's not always a solution. Sometimes your project doesn't need 3D methods like this, but sometimes it can benefit from it. All right, so let's go to southern Mexico, Monte Alban. This is another field site I work at, and it's located in, you can see here, southern Mexico in the state of Oaxaca, which is outlined here. And then Monte Alban is right there in the Oaxaca Valley, up on a hilltop. This is a picture of it from the drone. And as you can see, it's got this beautiful, nice big plaza and all of these buildings that surround the plaza and go through the middle of the plaza. This was part of a collaborative project with the University of Oklahoma and Mark Levine, who was, Mark Levine was the director of the project, and he was actually kind enough to invite me to come down and be a part of it. They were going to go and inspect the main plaza subsurface, so everything underneath the plaza, by using ground penetrating radar, electrical resistivity, and magnetometry. So in addition to that, I came in with my drone, and we actually did some modeling of the entire main plaza surface, as well as all of the buildings around it. So mapping was very much in the same way as we were doing it before, where we just have, the ground control points. Here I have them in stars all around the main plaza, as evenly distributed as possible. Our main objective was just the center plaza, although we did do modeling in the rest of the site. Here's a little picture of our ground control point on the ground. And this silver matte cap kind of model here is the actual product there, right? In the end, after doing photo capture for about 10 days, we had 14,000 photos, or more than 14,000 photos. And we were able to reconstruct the entire heart of the site of Monte Alban, which is this main plaza area. This was also using the supercomputers at Indiana University. So because of them, we were actually able to run a very high definition model. And as you'll see later, we were able to use it in virtual reality too. In general, though, it's amazing what this photogrammetry can do, because your ground resolution for an orthophoto is 1 centimeter per pixel. And then in terms of the digital surface model, the cell size, each one of those cells in the model is 9 centimeters by 9 centimeters. Every 9 centimeters by 9 centimeter point on the Earth has an elevation value. Because we have this, this 3D model, we can also do volumetric measurements. So here we have the measurement of volume of buildings. The buildings is here. This is building J. Putting a bottom on that building and making it watertight allows us to estimate volumes. You have kind of a little chart showing our volumes here, and that's just done right on the fly. It's one of the benefits there of photogrammetric work. Also, taking our model, we can create this digital surface model and use it in geographic information system software. So here I am at ArcGIS. I'm doing a very simple visibility analysis, viewshed analysis. And from this point here, these 2 points, everything in green is what you could see across the built environment of the main plaza. And you could see that over here, the interior patio of system M is visible, but over here, system 4, that interior patio is actually a little bit more private. So this gets to make you think about, the different spaces in Monte Alban and how they may have been used. Here's a Mesoamerican ball court at Monte Alban. And as you can see here, this is showing places where people can actually view the game, where this game can be seen. So everything in green are places where people could stand to see the game. It gets you into thinking about things like viewership or exclusion, like who was actually excluded in terms of watching this ball game versus who was included, making you think more about social complexity and themes like that. Another thing you can do with this digital surface model is model how sound propagates over the landscape. This is actually something we're currently working on, and we're thinking more about, what's that experience like? So here at all of these points, we have these performance points in place where we think there might have been somebody that was making a speech or doing some sort of performance there on the main plaza. And as you can see, at a higher speaking voice, within this 25 decibel circle, the red circles here, that's about where you would need to stand in order to understand what's being said. And that's with a background noise level of just kind of a murmur. So all of this can be done and modeled in ArcGIS. And down here, I kind of have the person who developed this tool. We've got a little citation for them here. They've done a really good job at developing that, and it's been working for us. And then, of course, because we had such a nice model and the texture was such high resolution, we were able to actually create a virtual reality environment that explores Building J, which is the one you see there on the screen. And Building J is this enigmatic building in Monte Alban that has all of these glyphs wrapped around the side of it. And I often talk about it in class. And if you teach Mesoamerican archaeology, you're probably talking about Monte Alban and Building J. So this is a great tool to put people inside of the environment so they can feel what it's like to be immersed. They can feel the monumentality. They can explore the different glyphs in their original context. Let's go ahead and turn to the Acoña Valley in southern Peru. Here in the Acoña Valley, I'll just kind of give you a location. Here's Peru, and we're down here in southern Peru, and this is our survey region here in the red. So in the Acoña Valley, we were charged to survey these places right here that are kind of blank. They had already done survey here in this region. They had already found a lot of sites, but we wanted to actually locate sites in these swaths of land here. So we do pedestrian survey. We walk around looking for sites, looking for evidence of anything. You can see my students there systematically walking across the landscape in transects. And it comes to the point at which, like, how then, once you find archaeological remains, and by the way, Peru has tons of them, they're everywhere, how do you actually map them efficiently and quickly? Enter the drone. So this is where we use UAVs or drones to map those sites quickly and also capture some really good detail so that you don't have to do a lot of it in the field. Right? So this was a kind of a modified methodology of combining pedestrian survey with UAV mapping. As you can see, I'm back in Agisoft here. We have our GCPs that we threw down on the ground, and we used a differential GPS to map, to geolocate all of these sites. And then instead of doing a lot of the work in field, we sample some things in field, we make sure that we're seeing what we're seeing, but there's a good portion of the work that actually happens in post-processing. So using kind of these digital survey techniques where we're locating sites and flagging them based on the ortho imagery and based on the digital surface model and changes in elevation. And then currently what I have some students working on now is digitization of these maps. So we did locate, I think it was like 12 different sites, and they're very dense sites. And part of our process now is to digitize them by drawing in ArcGIS each of these different polygons that represent buildings and structures, and then populating that with attributes that are associated with them. Alongside just being able to do survey quickly, sites like this one here can be analyzed for slope so that you can quickly see that there are buried structures. So for instance, you can see here this action, this erosional action that's coming from the west over here and then towards the east into the river. That obliterated this part of the site, but with our digital surface model, we can actually pick up some of these lines in the landscape and where those building footprints might actually be. And then you can tell that it would have continued from here all the way to the other side over here. So definitely helps us out in doing that. Having this perspective, the kind of digital perspective, and being able to play around with the data set allows us to see that better. But when you're on the ground, sometimes you see those things, sometimes you miss those things. So I do think that this is a beneficial strategy. That's really all I have for you guys today in terms of talking about photogrammetry, structure from motion, and actually how it can help us in archaeology, scholarship, public outreach, and even education. Here I just want to kind of acknowledge a few people directly. I want to say that with the Bethel Cemetery Relocation Project team, thank you to all of those people, especially the PIs and the managers. It's Ryan Peterson, we have Chris Schmidt, we have Jeremy Wilson, and all the people that are currently working on the report. Dr. Brooke Drew, by the way, has that video. If you are interested in looking more into this project, check it out. It's a really good lecture. But I wanted to highlight Josh Myers and Aaron Estes. They were our crew chiefs for the photogrammetry. They were trying something new, and they really hung in there with me as we were designing this and carrying it out. And of course, thank you to all the descendants in the descendant community of people that were buried there at Bethel Cemetery. Hopefully we did a good job at making sure that was relocated in an appropriate way. And we made sure to record the spatial layout and replicate our family groupings in the new location. So if you want any more information about the type of work we do with Structure for Motion, you can contact me. I've got all this info on my website there. You can check out some of the other research we do. But otherwise, that's all I've got.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. Now, keep in mind from a technology standpoint, I'm still back, looking at my finger through different eyes. So I'm glad you're answering these questions. But let's go through a few of the questions that came up during the talk. Some of these you might have addressed, but might be good to go back over them. Can LiDAR be integrated with photogrammetry?
It can, yeah. LiDAR will produce a similar data set, actually. So photogrammetry, if you remember that dense point cloud step, that's what LiDAR is producing. It's producing a dense point cloud. And depending on how the LiDAR is gathered, that LiDAR data, and whether or not it's been post-processed, it can typically actually have different returns. So if you know anything about LiDAR, LiDAR is light detection and ranging. You're shooting lasers down onto the surface of the earth if it's airborne LiDAR, and you're getting returns on those measurements, right? So the distance going down and then back up. But if you know anything about, let's see, archaeology, let's say in the Maya world, you've seen those headlines where they've discovered all of these things in the jungle. What's great about LiDAR is it can actually penetrate the foliage and give you a return for the ground as well as returns for the canopy. And so that data can be classified in a way where you can pull away the canopy and only see the surface. This is all to say that we're still using point clouds. And so LiDAR data and photogrammetry data can be combined. You can even take a LiDAR data set and decimate it quite a bit, pull it into Agisoft Metashape, and mesh that as well, turn it into a solid surface.
Great. And I know you talked about how many images you often have to use, but someone specifically asked about the headstone that you show at the very beginning of your talk. How many images did you use to create that? Do you know?
That specific one, I'm not sure. I always tell the crew, use at least 60 to 100 plus images. If you're in 200 images, you're too many for a headstone. That's just way too many. You have to cover every single angle. And I always go by the rule of thumb, take more images than less, because you can remove photos, but you can't create photos out of thin air.
And what's the approximate size of the final 3D image?
The final 3D image, I'd have to take a look at one of those, but just 1 second here. I've got one ready. So for instance, the tomb of Zaachila that I was showing you earlier, that frieze, looking at 77 megabytes for that little bit. So you're probably looking at about 100 megabytes for the OBJ file. The entire package together, let's see here, a couple gigabytes for all the exported products. In general, though, this is something that people don't often think about when they start doing photogrammetry, is how much space it's actually going to take. And it starts to add up too. Because, in Agisoft, you have the entire process that you're going through. And during that process, you might actually duplicate the models a couple times so you don't screw up and then have to try to do it all again. But all those duplications add up to the point where, we use hard drives that are in the orders of 2 to 5 terabytes. In the lab at the university, we actually have a couple 10 terabyte hard drives for various projects just to keep everything saved.
So that kind of gets into the cameras that you use. Are there minimum specifications? I mean, can I just go out there with my iPhone camera, or does it require something special?
Yeah, so you can go out and just take pictures with just a regular cell phone camera. It will make a model. I think the one I showed you here with Zaachila and the tomb was done with my cell phone. But that's something we use in class when we have the students go out and they'll do an exercise. They just use their cell phone cameras. What we have noticed is quality. Quality is not so great when you're using the cell phone cameras. iPhones do a really good job. I have noticed there was a Samsung or so brands that for some reason those images just would not reconstruct. They wouldn't align. But typically I would use a DSLR camera if you're going to do this professionally for archaeology, and then try to adhere to some of those standards that if you get online, look at places like cultural heritage imaging. It's a great place to start to think about how to make things for scientific endeavors.
And we have an attendee who mentioned that he was in the Air Force and they took millions of aerial photos that are in the National Archives. Could you take those and then?
You can actually take aerial photos and do that. Actually, aerial photos, those stereo pairs that they used to use to create like 3D models of landscape using those funny goggles that you would sit on the desk, those are using aerial photos. But if you have tons of them and they're all overlapping enough, you should be able to reconstruct and create a 3D model. I'm pretty sure I read a paper sometime this year that had somebody that was taking advantage of those data sets and doing that.
And what about just historic photographs? Do you have to have a building or whatever taken from a variety of angles, or if you just have a historic photograph that's maybe taken from 1 or 2 angles, is there anything that you can do with that?
Yes. For the structure for motion kind of work, you're going to want to have a bunch of angles. However, there are algorithms out there now, and deep learning can actually help us. That's AI, artificial intelligence can actually help us do reconstructions, even just based on one image. I've seen some papers where they've been able to now take one image and the algorithm will actually guess what's on the other side and start to reconstruct it. It's gotten to the point where you'll see a person standing there and they have a ripple in their clothes, and then the computer guesses where that ripple is going to go because it's able to recognize what is there in the image. Taking 2 images though is going to give you like your eyeballs, right? You'll have a little bit of depth there.
And going back to the LiDAR again, and using LiDAR, how can light penetrate opaque foliage or other solids?
The light itself is it's an active sensor, so it's shooting a laser down. But also you have to keep in mind there's millions of points kind of just being sprayed out over the landscape, and all of those points are hitting stuff and returning. So if it hits the top of the foliage, it returns, but then there's still some energy that allows it to continue down, and then you have a second return. I don't really know the technical aspects of that, but I know that there's different points in that wavelength that you could read and understand the various returns from the laser as it comes out, penetrates the foliage, hitting the top, mid-range, surface. But also with LiDAR, because you have so many points getting on the ground, you're likely to have a lot of returns from the ground surface itself. But I do want to mention too that in photogrammetry in a sparse forest, you can achieve some of the same things where you actually do photogrammetry, you create a dense cloud of the landscape, but if it's sparse enough, you can classify the points so that all those tree points can be culled away and you just are left with a bare earth model. But if it's a really truly dense forest, like the forest that was around Monte Alban that I was shooting before, can't really get rid of those because we don't have any ground points adjacent to it in a close enough proximity.
Is the Unity-based VR model that you mentioned available for public use?
It is not right now. As of now, we've actually just put it in there for testing. I've done a few things with it here and there, but I'd have to talk with Ryan Peterson at Cardno to see kind of what we want to do with that, where we want to go with it. But I think if there's enough demand, maybe people want to see that and be able to visit the old Bethel Cemetery.
Yeah, and similarly, the in-field alignment that you used for the Bethel project, is that outlined in the article that you published?
The infield alignment, yes, it is in the article we published, and that was something that our crew chief Josh Myers found while he was in the field doing it. He's like, well, we actually need to do an alignment on all of these burials instead of just a few of them, because at first we thought, oh, we'll just do a few and make sure things are going well, but it was actually better to do quality checks after every single excavated unit.
And kind of a comment and a question. 3D photogrammetry of cultural features is worth pursuing in CRM, but how do the images translate on a page of a report?
With the freedom of the 3D model, I guess the way we've seen it translate is with the freedom of the 3D model, you can rotate it, turn it into any direction, and take a screenshot of it, or at least capture that image at whatever resolution, as long as you're using, let's say, Agisoft Metashape. But I think that's kind of how it translates in a report. You can also take those models, put them online in a 3D repository like Sketchfab, for instance, and store them in a way that they're interactive, where somebody could just bring up that website, play around with those 3D models, twirl them around. And those links to that repository can be put in a report in an appendix, for instance. So I think it can still work that way. Also, Agisoft has the ability to export a PDF version of your 3D model. So Adobe opens up a PDF, and there in the PDF, you can actually rotate your 3D object and measure.
Well, we're at 1 o'clock, but in 30 seconds or less, we'll take one last question. What's the most interesting narrative that's been crafted resulting from this type of work? 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Interesting narrative is crafted. I would have to say, I don't know, pulling together multiple interpretations has been interesting to try to do from Montalban, for instance. A lot of stuff there on that site is debated and highly debated because it has a lot to do with, the early urbanization, and those symbol sets are very debated. So trying to make sure to share both interpretations or multiple interpretations of the data has been interesting to try to pull together in a narrative format for students to take in those lesson plans.
Well, it's been absolutely fascinating, and I look forward to learning more about this and seeing more examples. And just as a reminder to everyone, if you go to the Preserving Historic Places conference website, you'll find a link to Brooke Drew's program that she did on Bethel Cemetery, and then we'll have this one posted in the very near future. So I want to thank everybody for participating, and thank you, Alex. We really appreciate it and look forward to hearing from you more in the future.
You're welcome. Thank you to everybody who attended.